Arthur Bennett noticed the first truck because it came before sunrise. At 71, Arthur rarely needed an alarm. 45 years of orchard work had trained his body to wake while the house was still dark. That morning, he was pouring coffee when the sound of air brakes rolled across the eastern field. Arthur stepped onto the porch. A dump truck was moving along the service road beyond his property line. It stopped on a vacant parcel behind the northern edge of his orchard. The truck bed rose. Something heavy slid out. Arthur watched for a moment, then went back inside. The neighboring property had recently been leased by Hudson Valley Honey Processing. Arthur knew the company. They filtered honey, cleaned commercial hive frames, and processed beeswax from apiaries across the region. He assumed they were moving compost. 3 days later, another truck arrived. Then 2 more. By the following week, a pile had appeared beyond the fence. Arthur walked over after pruning. What he found was not compost. The material was brown, yellow, and almost black in places. Broken pieces of honeycomb were mixed with wax, dirt, dead bees, wood fragments, propolis, and sludge from the processing equipment. Even in the cold morning air, it smelled sweet, not pleasantly sweet, heavy, sticky. Arthur pushed his boot into the edge of the pile. The surface cracked. Underneath, the material was soft. A worker in a reflective vest noticed him. "You need something? What is this?" "Processing byproduct." Arthur looked at the growing mound. "You storing it?" "Temporary." "How temporary?" The worker shrugged. "You would have to call the office." Arthur did. A company representative explained that the material was an organic byproduct awaiting disposal. "It's mostly natural material," the man said. Arthur looked through his kitchen window toward the pile. "That wasn't my question." "Excuse me? How long is it staying?" "A few weeks." It stayed through February. Then March. By April, there were 6 piles. Some were taller than Arthur's tractor. Warm spring days softened the wax. Dark liquid collected underneath. The smell traveled across the orchard. Arthur began finding raccoons near the fence. Then mice. Then swarms of insects around the piles. He called again. This time, the company told him everything was contained on leased property. Arthur walked the boundary that afternoon. Technically, they were right. The piles stopped several feet from his fence, but farms did not obey lines drawn on deeds. Water moved. Animals moved. Wind moved. And Arthur's orchard sloped gently downhill from the storage site. He pointed that out. The representative promised someone would inspect it. No one came. Then, in the second week of May, the rain started. It fell for most of Thursday. By Friday morning, the drainage ditch along Arthur's northern orchard was full. Arthur put on his boots and walked out. Water poured beneath the fence. It was not clear. Brown foam moved across the surface. Pieces of wax floated in it. Arthur followed the ditch west. 20 yards farther, the channel disappeared completely beneath a thick yellow-brown mass. The waste had broken loose. Rainwater had carried it downhill and packed it into Arthur's drainage system. He stepped into the orchard. The first row of young pear trees stood in several inches of water. Around their trunks floated wax fragments, dead bees, pieces of comb, and black organic sludge. Arthur crouched beside one tree. The soil had become sticky enough to cling to his glove. He looked uphill. A section of one waste pile had collapsed. The material crossed beneath the fence in a broad trail. Arthur pulled out his phone. He photographed everything. The ditch, the fence, the flooded trees, the waste. Then he called Hudson Valley Honey Processing. A woman answered. Arthur explained what had happened. She placed him on hold. When she returned, her tone had changed. "Mr. Bennett, the material you're describing is primarily organic beeswax processing residue." Arthur stared at the buried ditch. "So? It is not classified as hazardous waste." "I didn't call it hazardous. There should be minimal environmental concern." Arthur looked at the pear trees standing in dirty water. "I have 23 young trees with their roots underwater because your material blocked my drainage ditch. We can send someone to assess the situation." "When?" "Early next week." Arthur looked at the sky. More rain was forecast that night. Send someone today. I can't guarantee that. Arthur ended the call. He spent the next 6 hours with a shovel. The waxy material was worse than mud. Mud moved when shoveled. This stretched, broke apart, and stuck to the steel. Arthur cleared 10 feet of ditch. Then 15. His back began hurting. By late afternoon, water finally started moving. He stood ankle deep in the channel, breathing heavily. Behind him, several acres of orchard were beginning to drain. Ahead of him, the waste pile remained. Arthur leaned on the shovel. A company could call something organic. A report could call it non-hazardous. A disposal contractor could call it byproduct. Arthur did not care what name they gave it. If something blocked water, drowned roots, attracted pests, and forced a 71-year-old farmer to spend 6 hours digging it out of his own land. There was a simpler word for it. A problem. The next truck arrived Monday morning. Arthur was waiting at the fence. This time, he did not watch it unload. By the middle of May, Arthur stopped thinking of the waste as a temporary nuisance. It was changing the orchard. The first sign was the water. After every rain, the northern rows stayed wet longer than the rest of the farm. The ditch Arthur had cleared kept clogging with pieces of wax and compacted comb. Sometimes the material floated. Sometimes it softened into a sticky mass and pressed against the culvert. Arthur cleared it 3 more times in 2 weeks. Each time, the same thing returned. Then came the insects. His orchard had always drawn bees. That was normal. He wanted pollinators. What he did not want were clouds of flies around the waste piles, yellow jackets gathering near the fence, and ants forming dark lines between the dumping site and his irrigation pipes. One morning, Arthur found chew marks on the bark of 2 young pear trees. He set traps. By the end of the week, he had caught 5 mice and 2 rats. That had never happened before. The worst damage was harder to see. Arthur noticed it while checking the western block. 4 young trees had leaves turning pale. Not dead. Weak. He knelt beside one and pushed a soil probe into the ground. The top few inches were damp. Too damp. The roots were sitting in soil that had not drained properly for days. Arthur dug down with a hand trowel. The smell changed below the surface. Sweet at first, then sour. He sat back on his heels. That afternoon, he called Hudson Valley Honey Processing again. A man named Curtis Lane finally came to inspect. Curtis arrived in a clean pickup and stayed close to the fence. Arthur showed him the blocked ditch, the damaged trees, the rodent traps, the wax fragments scattered through the orchard. Curtis took photographs. Then he said, "We still don't see evidence of toxic contamination." Arthur looked at him. "I didn't ask you about toxins." Curtis kept his voice polite. "Our material is primarily organic. You keep saying that because it matters." Arthur pointed toward the flooded row. "So does water." Curtis glanced at the trees. "We can reimburse reasonable cleanup costs." Arthur laughed once. "You think this is cleanup? What would you call it?" Arthur pointed toward the hill. "Your waste comes down every time it rains. I clear it. Then you bring more trucks." Curtis shifted his weight. "The storage site is legal. Then keep it on your side." Curtis did not answer. 2 days later, Arthur received an email from the company. They offered him a small payment, enough to cover several days of labor. In exchange, Arthur would sign a release, acknowledging that the incident had caused no permanent damage. Emily read the document at the kitchen table that weekend. "You should take the money." Arthur looked at her. "For what?" "For the cleanup. It isn't cleaned up. You can hire someone." "And next month?" Emily leaned back. "Dad, you are 71. Arthur's face changed slightly. She noticed, "I'm not saying you can't handle it. You were about to. I'm saying you shouldn't have to." Arthur looked out the window. The orchard had been part of Emily's childhood, but she had left years earlier. To her, selling a damaged section might be practical. To Arthur, it felt like surrendering evidence. Emily tapped the release. "If the company pays, use the money to fix the ditch and maybe sell the northern block." Arthur turned toward her. "Sell it to who?" "There are land buyers. Maybe the same people leasing to the company." Emily paused. "That's not the point." "It is exactly the point." Arthur took the release and folded it once. They made the problem. He placed it on the table. I'm not selling them the proof. The next morning, Arthur walked the northern rows again. 3 more trees showed stress. One had begun dropping leaves. He marked each trunk with red tape. By the end of the week, there were 11. That number bothered him more than the money. Trees took years. That was something people who did not farm often misunderstood. A damaged machine could be replaced. A young tree lost now meant years before another reached full production. Arthur walked to the fence. On the other side, a fresh truck was unloading. The pile spread slowly as it hit the ground. Yellow wax, dark comb, sludge, fragments of something that had once belonged inside thousands of beehives. Arthur watched the material fall. The company called it waste because they had no use for it. That did not mean it had no value. He did not know that yet, but he had spent his life around orchards long enough to distrust easy labels. Waste, organic, harmless, damaged, finished. They were all words people used when they wanted to stop looking closely. Arthur picked up a hardened piece of wax near the fence. It was dirty, dark, mixed with bits of wood and comb, but when he scraped the surface with his thumbnail, a cleaner yellow layer appeared underneath. He smelled it, faintly sweet. For the first time, Arthur did not throw it away. He put it in his coat pocket and carried it back to the barn. Arthur kept the piece of wax on his workbench for 3 days. He did not know why. It sat beside a box of pruning blades, a jar of rusted bolts, and Margaret's old garden shears, dark on the outside, yellow underneath. Every time Arthur passed it, he noticed the same faint smell: honey, smoke, wood, something else he could not place. On Thursday afternoon, he carried a bucket to the northern ditch and collected more of the material. Not the black sludge, not the mud. He picked the firmer pieces: old comb, wax clumps, broken caps, chunks mixed with bits of bark and dead bees. By the time he returned to the barn, the bucket weighed nearly 20 pounds. Arthur set an old steel pot on a propane burner behind the workshop. He had used the pot years earlier for boiling tree guards and cleaning metal fittings. He dropped in several pieces. At first, nothing happened. Then the wax softened. The darker material sank. A golden layer slowly appeared around the edges. Arthur lowered the flame. The mixture gave off a stronger smell as it warmed. Not rotten, not chemical. Sweet, earthy, almost familiar. He remembered Margaret lighting beeswax candles every Christmas. She hated strongly scented candles. Real wax smells like enough, she used to say. Arthur had never paid attention to how they were made. He watched the pot. The material did not burn the way agricultural waste usually burned. It melted. That difference mattered. He used a metal spoon to lift out a clump of debris. Underneath it, liquid wax gathered in the bottom of the pot. Arthur turned off the burner. He poured a small amount through an old piece of cloth into a tin can. The cloth caught dirt, wood fragments, and pieces of insect casing. The liquid below was still cloudy, but much cleaner. Arthur left it overnight. The next morning, he found a solid disc inside the can, golden brown, smooth on top. Sediment had settled beneath it. Arthur knocked it onto the bench. The disc made a hard sound against the wood. He scraped the underside with a knife. Dirty. He scraped the top. Clean yellow wax appeared. Arthur held it near his nose. The scent was stronger now. Not perfume. Honey and warm wood. He stood there longer than he expected. Then the barn door opened. Emily stepped inside carrying groceries. What is that? Arthur held up the disc. Part of the mess. She frowned. That came from the dump site? From my ditch. And you melted it? Yes. Why? Arthur looked at the wax. I wanted to know what was in it. Emily set the groceries down. And? Mostly dirt. That sounds encouraging. Not all dirt. Arthur cut the disc in half. The center was cleaner than the outside. Emily touched it with one finger. That is actually wax. Arthur nodded. Enough of it is. How much? I do not know yet. That question stayed with him. How much? If 10 pounds of dirty material produced 1 pound of usable wax, the idea meant almost nothing. If 10 pounds produced 5, that changed things. Arthur spent the next week testing. He weighed every batch before melting, then weighed the cleaned wax afterward. The first batch was terrible. Too much mud. The second was better. The third came from a section of the pile filled with old comb and wax caps. That batch surprised him. Nearly half the weight remained after filtering. Arthur wrote the numbers in a notebook. He began separating the waste into categories: dark sludge, low value, old wood and debris, almost none, broken comb, better, yellow cappings and wax fragments, best. The company had mixed everything together because to them it was all the same thing: waste. Arthur no longer saw one material. He saw several. On Saturday, he made another test. This time, he pushed a piece of cotton string through the center of a small wax block. He placed it in a shallow jar, lit it. The flame lasted less than a minute, then went out. Arthur tried again with thicker string. The flame smoked badly. The wax pooled unevenly. Emily watched from the doorway. "So you are making candles now?" "No. That looks like a candle. It looks like a bad candle." She smiled. Arthur did not. He was irritated by the failure. Not because he expected success, because he realized there was more to this than melting wax and adding a wick. That evening, he scraped the failed wax back into the pot. He could have stopped there. He had already proven the material contained usable beeswax. That alone changed how he saw the piles. But the next morning, Arthur drove into town. He stopped outside a small craft store owned by Clara Reed. Margaret used to buy holiday candles there. Arthur had not been inside since she died. He carried one of the cleaned wax discs under his arm. When Clara saw him, she smiled. "Arthur Bennett, I haven't seen you in years." Arthur placed the wax on the counter. Clara looked at it, then at him. "What is this?" Arthur answered carefully. "I think it is something everyone else threw away." Clara picked it up. She smelled it once. Her expression changed. "This came from raw beeswax?" "Mostly." "Where did you get it?" Arthur looked through the shop window toward the road, leading back to his orchard. "From the problem they buried my trees in." Clara turned the wax over in her hands. Then she looked at Arthur again. "This is dirty." "I know, but it is good wax underneath." Arthur nodded. "That is what I came to ask?" Clara smiled. "No." Arthur frowned. "No what?" "You did not come to ask if it is wax." She placed the disc back on the counter. "You already know that." Arthur said nothing. Clara tapped the wax with one finger. "You came to ask whether it is worth saving." Arthur looked at the golden surface. That was exactly the question. And for the first time, someone else understood it too. Clara did not let Arthur leave with the wax. She carried the disc into the back room of her shop, where a stainless steel pot sat beneath a shelf lined with molds, wick spools, and jars of fragrance oil. "I haven't made candles seriously in years," she said. Arthur looked around. "You still have enough equipment." "That is because people who make things never throw away the expensive tools." Arthur almost smiled. Clara placed the wax on a scale. "First problem is contamination. You filtered it. Once. Twice. Still not enough." She broke off a small piece and held it against the light. Dark specks were suspended inside. "If that gets near the wick, the flame will struggle." That happened. Of course it did. Arthur folded his arms. "So what do I do?" Clara filled the lower half of a double boiler with water. "You stop treating it like dirty candle wax." Arthur frowned. "What is the difference?" "You are cleaning raw agricultural residue. That is a different problem." They melted the sample slowly. Clara kept the temperature low enough to avoid scorching the wax. As it softened, Arthur saw layers separating. Heavy debris settled. Lighter particles floated. Clara skimmed the top, then poured the liquid through tightly woven cotton. The first filter darkened immediately. She replaced it, then filtered again. The wax that emerged was clearer. Still amber. Still imperfect. But Arthur could finally see through the thin stream as it entered the metal pitcher. Clara smelled it. "Good. You can tell from that?" "I can tell you didn't burn it." Arthur looked at the temperature gauge. "That matters? With beeswax? Everything matters." She poured a small amount into a plain glass jar. Then came the wick. Arthur reached for the thick cotton cord he had brought from home. Clara stopped him. That is why you are smoked. What is wrong with it? Too much fuel. Arthur looked at the string. It is string. It becomes fuel when wax climbs it. She opened a drawer containing labeled wick sizes. For 10 minutes. She explained how wick diameter had to match the jar. Wax type. And burn pool. Arthur listened more carefully than he had expected. He knew irrigation pressure, pruning angles, soil drainage, fruit thinning. This was another system, different materials. Same rule. Every part affected another. They made 3 candles, one with a smaller wick, one medium, one slightly larger. Clara marked the bottoms with numbers. Then they waited. Arthur disliked waiting. Warm wax looked finished long before it was ready. Clara knew that too. Go get coffee, she said. I can wait. You are staring at them. I'm observing. You are 71 years old. Arthur, you can survive 20 minutes without controlling something. He gave her a look. She laughed. When the candles had cooled enough, Clara trimmed the wicks. They lit the first. The flame was weak. After several minutes, it tunneled down the center. Too small, Clara said. The second candle burned better. The wax pool widened gradually. No smoke. No flicker. The third burned too aggressively. The flame leaned high and began forming soot on the glass. Clara extinguished it. They returned to the second candle. 10 minutes. 20. 30. The flame stayed steady. Arthur leaned closer. The scent surprised him. Warm honey. Dry grass. Something floral beneath it. Nothing had been added. That smell was already in there? Clara nodded. Beeswax carries traces of where it came from. Arthur looked at the flame. For weeks, that same material had been clogging his ditch. He had scraped it from mud, pulled it from around tree roots, cursed it every time it stuck to his shovel. Now it sat on a wooden counter producing a clean golden flame. Clara watched his expression. You see the problem? Arthur looked at her. What problem? You're already thinking bigger. I'm thinking about the piles. Exactly. Arthur glanced toward the candle. How much usable wax do you think is in them? I don't know. Could it be worth processing? Clara hesitated. As candles? Yes. That depends on quality, consistency, labor, safety, packaging. Whether customers care, they buy beeswax candles. They buy good beeswax candles. Arthur nodded. That distinction mattered. He reached toward the jar, then stopped before touching the hot glass. What would this sell for? Clara looked at the plain jar. Like this? Maybe $12? Arthur raised his eyebrows. For one candle? She smiled. You think that is expensive? It is wax in a glass. That is why yours would sell for 12. Arthur stared at her. What changes the price? Everything around the wax. She pointed toward the shelves in the front of the shop. Design. Story. Consistency. Presentation. Trust. Arthur looked back at the candle. He had spent 45 years selling fruit by weight. A bushel of apples had a price. A crate of pears had a price. He understood products you could measure. This was different. People were not only buying material, they were buying how the material made them feel. Arthur was not sure he liked that. But he understood one thing clearly. The wax was not worthless. Clara extinguished the candle after an hour and inspected the melt pool. Best one is number 2. Arthur picked up the jar after it cooled. Can I take it? It's your wax. He carried it home that evening. After dinner, he placed the candle on the kitchen table. The house had been quiet since Margaret died. Too quiet sometimes. Arthur lit the wick. A small golden flame appeared. The familiar honey scent slowly filled the room. He sat across from it. Margaret used to light candles like this in winter. Back then, Arthur never asked what made one candle better than another. Now he wished he had. He looked toward the dark orchard outside. Beyond the trees, the waste piles were still there. For the first time, Arthur did not see only what they had damaged. He saw what might be hidden inside them. The problem had not become an opportunity yet, but one clean flame had made that possibility impossible to ignore. Arthur stopped collecting the waste randomly. That changed everything. Until then, he had treated the material as one problem. Clara had shown him it was not one material at all. Some pieces were nearly useless. Others were mostly beeswax buried under dirt. So Arthur began sorting. He marked 4 steel bins inside the barn. Sludge, comb, cappings, mixed. Every morning, before orchard work, he walked the northern boundary with a shovel and 2 buckets. The dark sludge went into the first bin, broken comb into the second, lighter yellow fragments into the third. Everything uncertain went into the fourth. Within a week, the difference was obvious. The sludge produced almost nothing worth saving. It smelled sour when heated and left thick residue at the bottom of the pot. The old comb was better. But the cappings were different. When Arthur melted a batch collected from the lighter material near the edge of one pile, the wax came out nearly gold. Clara held the cooled block toward the window. That is good. How good? Good enough that you should stop mixing it with the dark stuff. Arthur already had. He started weighing everything. 20 pounds of mixed debris might yield only 6 pounds of usable wax. 20 pounds of cleaner cappings could yield more than twice that. He wrote each result in a notebook. Source: weight before melting, weight after filtering, color, odor, amount of sediment. He did not call it a business. Not yet. It was still an experiment, but the barn slowly changed. 1 burner became 2. Then Arthur added a stainless filtering pot. He built a rack to hold cloth filters over metal containers. The first setup leaked wax onto the floor. The second sagged when the material became too hot. The third worked. Arthur learned to melt slowly. Too much heat darkened the wax. Too little made filtration nearly impossible. Some batches needed 3 passes. Others needed 5. He learned to let the wax settle before pouring again. Heavy contaminants dropped to the bottom. Cleaner wax stayed above. He began cutting the dirty base off each cooled block before remelting it. The process took hours. That was the part the processing company had avoided. It was easier for them to throw everything into one waste stream than separate the valuable fraction from the dirty one. Arthur understood why. Labor was expensive. Patience was expensive too. One afternoon, Emily entered the barn and stopped. Metal pots lined one wall. Cooling blocks sat on trays. Labels hung from nearly every container. This looks less like cleanup. Arthur continued writing in his notebook. It is still cleanup. You built a processing line. I built tables. Emily picked up 1 block of pale wax. It smelled faintly floral. This came from that mess? Yes. She held another darker block beside it. They are different colors, different material, different bees, maybe different forage, maybe different age, maybe both. Arthur had started noticing patterns. Some wax smelled warm and deep. Some was lighter. Some carried a stronger propolis note. At first, he had assumed variation was a defect. Clara disagreed. Do not bleach the life out of it, just to make every batch identical. Arthur looked at her. Customers want consistency. They want quality. That is not the same? No. She placed 2 blocks side by side. If one is naturally darker, that is not bad. It is only bad if you pretend they are identical. That idea stayed with him. Arthur had spent decades grading apples. Size mattered. Color mattered. Bruising mattered. But no 2 apples were exactly alike. Why should wax be? Instead of forcing every batch toward the same appearance, he began recording what made each one different. Clara helped him make test candles from 3 batches. The first burned with a mild honey scent. The second smelled deeper, almost resinous. The third had barely any scent at all. All 3 burned cleanly. Arthur lined them up on the workbench. This is not consistent. Clara shook her head. It is not uniform. What is the difference? Uniform means everything looks the same. Consistent means everything is good. Arthur looked at the 3 flames. That distinction changed the project again. He had been trying to rescue wax. Now he began thinking about character. That evening, he walked back to the waste piles. The company had added another load. For months, the sight had made him angry. It still did. His trees had suffered. His drainage had been damaged. He had not forgotten any of that. But now he saw the piles differently. Dark sludge near the bottom. Old comb in the middle. Cleaner wax near the top. One truckload might contain several completely different values depending on how carefully someone separated them. Arthur picked up a yellow fragment and scraped away the dirt with his thumb. Clean wax appeared underneath. He thought about what Clara had said. Not uniform. Consistent. Back in the barn, Arthur placed the fragment beside 3 finished candles. Then he opened a fresh page in his notebook. At the top, he wrote, "What if the differences are the product?" For the first time, he was no longer asking how much waste he could remove from the orchard. He was asking how much value had been buried inside it. Clara asked Arthur to bring 6 finished candles to her shop. Not test candles. Finished ones. Arthur resisted the idea for almost a week. He was still thinking like a farmer. If a batch of apples had not been graded, boxed, and priced properly, he did not put it in front of customers. These candles felt unfinished. The wax colors varied slightly. The jars were plain. The labels were handwritten. Clara disagreed. They are ready enough to answer one question. What question? Will anyone pay for them? Arthur brought 6 jars on a Tuesday morning. 3 contained lighter beeswax. 3 were made from a darker batch with a stronger honey scent. Clara arranged them on a small wooden shelf near the front counter. Arthur looked at the price tags. $32? Yes. For this? Clara looked at him. You keep saying that? Because it is wax in a jar. It is clean beeswax. Hand-filtered. Hand-poured. Limited batch. And naturally scented by the material itself. Arthur frowned. That sounds like a lot of words for wax. That is because you know what it took to make. He left before the shop opened. By noon the next day, Clara called. All 6 are gone. Arthur thought he had misheard her. Gone where? People bought them. All of them? Yes. At $32? Yes. Arthur. He was silent. Clara laughed. You sound offended? I'm trying to understand it. Then come in. When Arthur arrived, Clara showed him the sales receipts. 2 candles had gone to 1 customer. Another had been bought as a birthday gift. 1 woman had returned an hour after buying the first and purchased a second. Arthur studied the receipts like crop records. What did they ask? Mostly what the wax was. And I told them, all of it? I told them it came from recovered orchard, adjacent beeswax waste that you cleaned and processed. Arthur looked at her. You said waste? Why hide it? Because it sounds cheap. Clara shook her head. It sounds recovered. That distinction bothered Arthur because he understood immediately why it mattered. Cheap meant unwanted. Recovered meant overlooked. Clara reached beneath the counter and brought out a wide ceramic vessel made by a local potter. I want to try something else. Arthur looked at it. That is too nice for a candle. Exactly. She asked him to make 1 larger candle using the cleanest amber batch. No added fragrance. No artificial color. Just beeswax. Arthur poured it that evening. The larger diameter required another wick test. The first wick tunneled. The second smoked. The third burned evenly. Clara placed the finished candle in the front window. Price: 40 yuan. Arthur objected immediately. No. Clara did not change it. It cost me 12 for the ceramic vessel. That still does not make it 48. It does if someone thinks it is worth 48. Arthur shook his head. You cannot price things based on feelings. Clara smiled. You have sold apples your whole life. You absolutely can. Arthur stared at her. A premium apple costs more because it is better. Yes. Bigger. Cleaner. Better color. And this candle is better because? Arthur looked at it. Clean wax. Handmade vessel. Long burn. No synthetic fragrance. A story attached to the material. Clara waited. Arthur finally said, It took too much work. That too. The candle sold before lunch. The buyer was a woman visiting from Albany. She asked where the scent came from. Clara told her nothing had been added. The woman smelled the candle again. Then she bought it without asking for a discount. Arthur happened to be in the shop. He watched the transaction from near the back wall. After the customer left, he walked to the empty display. She paid $48. Clara nodded. For 1 candle. Yes. Arthur looked genuinely confused. What am I missing? Clara leaned against the counter. You think she bought wax? What did she buy? She bought something natural. Something limited. Something made by a real person. Something with a reason to exist. Arthur said nothing. Clara continued. Luxury is not always gold packaging and perfume. She pointed toward the empty space where the candle had been. Sometimes luxury is knowing somebody spent hours doing something slowly because doing it faster would make it worse. That sentence stayed with Arthur all afternoon. Back at the orchard, he walked through the barn and looked at his processing setup. The steel pots, the stained filters, the cooling racks, nothing about it looked luxurious. It looked like work. He picked up one block of beeswax and turned it over in his hands. The company had thrown it away because separating the useful part from the dirty part required too much effort. Arthur had nearly thought the same way. Now people were paying more for one candle than he sometimes earned from several bushels of ordinary fruit. That did not mean he had discovered easy money. The labor was still real. The yield was inconsistent. One bad batch could erase the profit from several good ones. But the economics had changed. Arthur opened his notebook. For the first time, he added a new column beside wax yield and burn time. Selling price. Then another. Labor hours. He stared at both columns. If this was going to become more than an experiment, he needed to understand something. Farmers understood better than almost anyone. A high price did not automatically mean a good business. The next question was not whether people would buy the candles. They already had. The question was whether Arthur could make them well enough, consistently enough, to deserve the price. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning. Hudson Valley Honey Processing wanted Arthur to stop using wax recovered from the runoff. Arthur read the sentence twice. Months earlier, the same material had clogged his ditch, flooded pear roots, and been described as a harmless disposal byproduct. Now the company called it property. Emily read the letter that afternoon. They're claiming ownership. Arthur nodded. Do they have it? I don't know. That was different from what Arthur wanted to believe. The wax had crossed onto his land. He had removed it because the company had not, but that did not automatically answer who owned every recoverable piece inside the runoff. So Arthur did something he disliked. He called a lawyer. Martha Sloan spent 2 hours reviewing photographs, emails, the cleanup offer, and Arthur's records showing where each recovered batch had come from. When she finished, she closed the folder. They may have an argument about ownership. Arthur frowned. After calling it waste? Calling something waste doesn't necessarily settle title. Then I should give it back? I didn't say that. She tapped the photographs of the flooded orchard. They also have a problem. Their material left the storage site, entered your drainage system, and damaged your property. You documented it. They offered cleanup money, and they continued storing material uphill after the first incident. Arthur leaned back. So who owns the wax? Martha shook her head. That is exactly the kind of question people spend too much money answering in court. 3 days later, Curtis Lane returned with the company's attorney. This time, Arthur's lawyer sat beside him at the kitchen table. Hudson Valley offered to remove the remaining piles closest to the boundary, reimburse documented orchard damage, and purchase Arthur's processed wax. In exchange, Arthur would release future claims arising from the earlier runoff and stop identifying the candles as coming from Hudson Valley's discarded material. Arthur looked at Martha. She said nothing. The choice was his. What about the runoff? Arthur asked. Curtis folded his hands. We'll install containment, not improve it. Install it. The attorney glanced toward Curtis. Arthur continued. Berm along the boundary. Covered storage, where practical. Clear access to the drainage channel. And no more piles uphill from my pear block. Curtis hesitated. That adds cost. Arthur looked through the window toward the damaged trees. So did 11 dead pears. They negotiated for nearly 3 hours. Arthur did not win everything. Neither did the company. Hudson Valley agreed to move the highest-risk piles, install runoff controls, and reimburse verified damage and cleanup expenses. Arthur agreed not to collect material from the company's side of the fence. The wax already recovered from his property remained with him under the settlement, without either side admitting who would have owned it, absent the agreement. That wording irritated Arthur. Martha told him to leave it alone. You wanted the drainage fixed? I did. You wanted your losses covered? Yes. You wanted to keep the wax already processed. Arthur looked toward the barn. Yes. Then don't pay a judge to give you a prettier sentence. Arthur signed. 2 weeks later, equipment arrived behind the northern fence. The nearest waste piles began moving. A berm took shape along the slope. For the first time in months, Arthur watched rain fall without immediately reaching for a shovel. But another problem had appeared. The candles were selling, and once Hudson Valley contained its waste properly, Arthur's accidental source of wax would disappear. That evening, he stood in the barn beside several finished candles, and the remaining recovered blocks. The runoff had started the business. It could not be allowed to become the business. Arthur picked up his notebook. If the candles were going to survive after the dispute ended, he needed a source of wax that did not depend on someone else making a mistake. The first complaint came from Clara. She called Arthur just after opening the shop. "One of the new candles is tunneling badly." Arthur stopped pruning. "How badly?" "Half the wax is still stuck to the glass." "Which batch?" "Dark amber. The one you poured Tuesday." Arthur was already walking toward the barn. "Pull the rest." "All of them? All from that batch?" Clara paused. "There are 14. Pull them." Arthur hung up. The batch had looked fine. That was what bothered him. The wax had filtered cleanly. Color was rich. Scent was strong. The test candle had burned for 40 minutes without smoke. Arthur had assumed that was enough. It was not. He relit one from the same batch in the barn. For the first 15 minutes, everything looked normal. Then the flame shortened. The melt pool stopped widening. A dark ring began forming around the wick. Arthur leaned closer. Tiny particles were collecting in the liquid wax. Not dirt exactly, something finer. He extinguished the candle and cut it open after cooling. Near the bottom, a thin layer of residue had settled through the wax. Arthur had missed it because the color hid it. Emily came in while he was slicing the second candle apart. "What happened?" "Bad batch." "How many?" 14 in the shop. 22 still here." Emily looked toward the shelves. "That's a lot of product. It's 36 candles that shouldn't leave this barn." She picked up one. "They look fine." "That's the problem." Arthur traced the batch back to its source. The wax had come from a section of waste piled close to a cleaning station. It contained more fine debris than the earlier loads. When melted, most contamination had settled normally, but some particles were small enough to remain suspended through his usual filtering process. They reached the wick, then restricted the flame. Arthur wrote one word in his notebook, "filtering," then crossed it out. The problem was not only filtering, it was classification. He had treated this material as if it belonged with the dark comb batches. It did not. Clara arrived that afternoon, carrying the 14 candles in 2 boxes. Arthur refunded the one customer who had complained and contacted 3 others who had purchased from the same lot. 2 reported no issue yet. Arthur replaced their candles anyway. Emily watched him write the refunds into the ledger. "You're losing money on all of this?" "Yes." "Couldn't you wait to see which ones actually fail?" Arthur looked at her. "If I'm selling them for premium prices, I don't get to wait for customers to discover my mistakes." That evening, he and Clara burned 6 samples from 6 different sections of the batch. 4 performed poorly. 2 burned acceptably. Arthur rejected all of them. Clara did not argue. That is the difference between selling candles and building a reputation. Arthur stared at the waste bin filling with failed product. It's an expensive difference. It always is. For the next week, Arthur changed the entire process. Every incoming batch received a number. Every container carried that number through melting, filtering, cooling, and pouring. He added source location, date collected, raw weight, wax yield, color, odor, sediment level. Then came the burn test. Not 40 minutes. 4 hours. Arthur tested each batch in the actual jar and wick combination he intended to sell. If the flame became unstable, the batch stopped there. If soot formed, stopped. If the melt pool developed incorrectly, stopped. No exceptions. He also built a finer filtration stage, using layered cloth and settling time instead of forcing hot wax through quickly. The slower process irritated him. It also worked. A batch that once took half a day now took nearly 2. Production fell. Quality improved. When Clara returned a week later, She found Arthur staring at 3 clean test candles burning on the workbench. How long? 3 hours. 27 minutes. You're timing them? Every one. Clara smiled. You're becoming difficult. I was difficult before. Now you're documented. Arthur handed her the new batch sheet. She read it. Source. Yield. Sediment. Burn time. Wick? She looked up. You know this is starting to look like a real operation. Arthur glanced toward the failed candles in the scrap box. That batch cost me almost a week. Clara shook her head. No? It did. It bought you a process. Arthur said nothing. That sentence stayed with him. The bad batch had exposed something more dangerous than contamination. Arthur had started trusting appearances. Clean wax. Good color. Nichts scent. Fast sales. He had begun assuming success because customers were paying. The failed candles reminded him that premium prices created a stricter obligation, not an easier one. By the end of the month, the next collection reached Clara's shop. Every candle carried a small batch number on the bottom. Most customers never noticed it. Arthur did. He knew which wax went into each jar, where it came from, how many times it had been filtered, how long it had burned under test. That knowledge did not make the candles luxurious. It made them dependable, and Arthur was beginning to understand that if people were going to pay for a story about rescued wax, the story could never be allowed to become more important than the flame. Arthur did not want the candles to look like everyone else's. That became clear the first time Clara showed him a catalog from a large candle company. Rows of identical jars, identical labels, identical colors, clean, professional, forgettable. Arthur flipped through the pages and pushed the catalog back across the counter. They all looked the same. That is usually the point. Clara said, Then why would anyone remember mine? Clara smiled. Now you are asking the right question. By then, Arthur had enough reliable wax to make small runs without worrying about quality. The bad batch had forced him to slow down, but it had also given him control. Every batch now had a source, a burn record, a color range. À son profil, Arthur began laying finished wax blocks across the workbench. One was pale yellow, one darker amber, one had a stronger honey smell, another carried a faint resin note from propolis. At first, he had treated those differences as problems. Now he started naming them. The lightest batch became apple blossom, not because he added apple fragrance. He refused to. The wax itself was mild, clean, and soft enough in scent that Clara said it reminded her of the orchard in spring. The darker batch became autumn hive. It carried more warmth, deeper honey, a heavier color. The third became old orchard. That one mattered most to Arthur. It used the least altered wax. No added scent. No artificial color. The ceramic vessel was rough, earth-toned, and slightly uneven because a local potter made each one by hand. Emily saw the names written on 3 paper labels. You are making a collection? Arthur looked at her. I am making 3 candles. That is a collection. Sounds more expensive when you say it. That is also the point. Arthur frowned. Emily had begun helping with packaging and orders. Unlike him, she understood immediately that the candles needed more than a jar and a handwritten price. But she also understood something Arthur feared she might miss. The orchard had to remain real. No invented stories, no fake heritage language, no claim that bees had gathered nectar from Arthur's trees unless they knew that was true. No suggestion that every candle came from the same hive or exact source. Arthur insisted on that. If we don't know it, we don't print it. Emily nodded. Agreed. They designed the labels around what they could prove. Recovered natural beeswax. Small batch. Filtered and poured at Bennett Orchard. Color and scent may vary naturally. Clara loved the last line. Most brands hide variation. Arthur looked at the amber wax. Why? Because people are trained to think identical means quality. Arthur picked up 2 candles from different batches. They are both good. Exactly. So why pretend they are the same? They did not. That decision became the identity of the collection. Apple blossom stayed lighter. Autumn hive remained deeper in color. Old orchard changed slightly from batch to batch. Instead of correcting those differences, Emily printed a small card explaining them. Natural beeswax changed depending on source material. Aya. And what had been carried into the hive. Arthur read the card twice. No poetry. Emily Sahil. It is not poetry. It says each batch carries the season differently. That is true. It sounds like a wine bottle. Clara laughed from across the table. Leave it. Arthur reluctantly did. The first full orchard collection launched in Clara's shop on a Saturday. 12 apple blossom, 10 autumn hive, 8 old orchard, 30 candles total. Arthur expected the lighter ones to sell first. He was wrong. Old orchard sold out by noon. A customer asked if more were available. Clara told her the next batch might be slightly different in color. The woman shrugged. That is why I like it. Arthur heard that from the back of the shop. It stopped him. For months. He had believed premium meant perfection. Now he was learning premium could also mean honesty. Not every variation had to be eliminated. Only the bad ones. That afternoon, Emily handed him the sales sheet. Old Orchard had the highest price. It had also sold fastest. Arthur looked at the empty shelf. What did they say? Emily smiled. They said it felt real. Arthur disliked the vagueness of that answer. But he understood the result. The candle was not pretending to be manufactured luxury. It looked like the material it came from. Slightly uneven color. Natural scent. Heavy ceramic. Simple label. No attempt to hide the work behind it. Back at the farm, Arthur walked through the orchard before sunset. The damaged northern rows were still recovering. Several young trees had been replaced. Some had not. The place was not fixed yet. Neither was the business. But something had changed. The orchard was no longer only where the problem happened. It had become part of the product without being turned into a costume. Arthur returned to the barn and looked at the 3 labeled shelves. Apple Blossom, Autumn Hive, Old Orchard. For the first time, he understood why Clara had refused to let him treat the candles as generic beeswax. The wax had differences. The orchard had history. The work had scars. Trying to erase all of that would have made the candles cleaner. It would also have made them ordinary. The email arrived just after 6 in the morning. Emily saw it first. She came into the barn holding her phone, while Arthur was checking a cooling rack. You need to read this. Arthur did not look up. If it is another customer asking whether Old Orchard will be the exact same color next month, tell them no. It is not a customer. Emily placed the phone in front of him. The message came from a lifestyle retailer in Manhattan. They had seen the orchard collection through Clara's shop. They wanted a wholesale order. Arthur read the quantity. Then read it again. 180 candles? First order. Arthur looked at her. First, if they sell, they want a recurring shipment. He set the phone down. No. Emily stared at him. You did not even finish reading. I read enough. This could change the business. That is what worries me. The order was larger than everything Arthur had produced in the previous 2 months combined. The retailer wanted 3 sizes. Uniform packaging. Delivery within 5 weeks. They also requested a larger percentage of Old Orchard, the slowest candle to produce because Arthur refused to overprocess the wax. Emily pulled out a chair. We can do this? With what wax? We have inventory. Not enough clean inventory. We can process more. With what time? Emily hesitated. Arthur pointed toward the orchard. Pear harvest starts in 3 weeks. We hire help. For candles? For both. Arthur shook his head. The problem was not labor alone. The candles had become reliable because every batch moved slowly. So, melt, settle, filter, cool, inspect, remelt, pour, burn test. If Arthur compressed that process to chase volume, the exact thing that made the product valuable would become the first thing sacrificed. Emily knew the argument. She also knew the numbers. She opened the wholesale sheet. If we fill this order, we can replace the north drainage line this year instead of next. Arthur looked at the total. She continued, and replant the damaged pear block. He said nothing. That part hurt. 11 trees were already gone. 7 more were weak. The orchard had delayed those repairs because the candle operation had absorbed cash. This order could reverse that. Emily leaned forward. You keep saying the candles are supposed to help the orchard. They are. Then let them. Arthur looked at the rows of finished jars. He wanted to say yes. That was why he distrusted the decision. That afternoon, Clara came to the farm. Arthur showed her the order. She read it carefully. You are going to turn it down. Probably. Why? Too much. That is not an answer. Arthur picked up one of the batch sheets. I know what happens when we rush. Clara nodded. The bad batch. I am not doing that again. Then do not rush. He frowned. They want 180. So offer them fewer. Emily looked up. They may walk. Clara shrugged. Then they walk? Arthur stared at her. You make that sound easy. No. I make it sound expensive. She placed the order sheet on the workbench. There are 2 ways this can break you. Arthur waited. You can say yes and destroy your quality. She tapped the quantity. Or you can say no to every opportunity until this stays a hobby. That landed harder. Arthur had been protecting the process. Maybe too much. He spent the evening calculating capacity honestly, not best-case capacity, real capacity. With orchard work, with testing, with one failed batch built into the schedule, by midnight, he had a number. 96. That was what he could guarantee. The next morning, Emily called the retailer. Arthur sat beside her. We can supply 96 units in 5 weeks. She said. There was a pause. The buyer asked, why not 180? Arthur motioned for the phone. Emily handed it over. Because 96 is what I know I can make properly. The buyer asked whether he could subcontract. No. Could he shorten burn testing? No. Could he use more standardized wax to increase output? No. Another pause. Arthur expected the call to end. Instead, the buyer asked when the remaining 84 could arrive. Arthur looked at Emily. Another 4 weeks after the first shipment. The buyer agreed. Not because Arthur had won an argument. Because scarcity supported the product they were trying to sell. After the call, Emily smiled. You just turned down half an order and somehow kept all of it. Arthur shook his head. I delayed half. That is still progress. 5 weeks later, 96 candles left Bennett Orchard in 12 carefully packed boxes. Every batch had passed its full burn test. Every label matched the record sheet. Every old orchard candle showed slight, natural variation. Arthur watched the delivery truck disappear down the road. He did not feel triumphant. He felt relieved. Emily stood beside him. You know what you said to that buyer? Arthur looked at her. What? She repeated the sentence he had used on the phone. I can make more candles. I can't make more trust. Arthur looked toward the barn. That sounded better than I meant it. Emily smiled. It usually does. 3 days later, the retailer sent another email. The first shipment had not even reached the shelves yet. They wanted to discuss a second order Elias. Arthur closed the message, then walked back to the filtering room. The next batch was waiting. Opportunity could wait 5 minutes. Bad wax would not clean itself. The first money from the Manhattan order did not go into the candle business. Arthur used it on drainage. A contractor arrived in early September with a small excavator and 2 pallets of pipe. For years, Arthur had repaired the northern ditch himself with a shovel, a backhoe, and whatever gravel he had on hand. This time, he replaced the problem properly. A larger drainage line went beneath the access road. The collapsed section near the orchard boundary was rebuilt. A shallow swale redirected runoff away from the young pear block. Arthur stood beside the trench while the contractor lowered the final pipe. Emily watched him. You could have bought a new pouring tank. I already have a pouring tank. You complain about it every day? It still pours. She smiled. The next money went toward trees. Arthur ordered 12 young pear trees to replace the worst losses. Then 5 apple trees. Then irrigation fittings. Then new gravel for the road behind the barn. The candle business had started because the orchard was being damaged. Now the candles were paying to repair it. That mattered more to Arthur than the sales numbers. But the waste piles were still there. Hudson Valley honey processing had improved the barriers after the dispute, and fewer residues crossed onto Arthur's land. Still, he no longer wanted his business dependent on material he had no control over. That became the next problem. Clara brought it up first. You cannot build a serious product around accidental runoff. Arthur knew. If they clean the site properly, your supply disappears. It should disappear. Exactly. Arthur looked at the wax inventory. For the first time, he understood that success created a strange contradiction. He wanted the original waste problem gone. But if it vanished, the candle business needed another source. Emily began contacting local beekeepers. Most sold honey. Some sold clean beeswax. But many had small amounts of cappings, old comb, damaged blocks, and filtering residue that were inconvenient to process. Arthur visited the first beekeeper himself. The man, Daniel Ross, kept nearly 300 hives. Behind his honey room were several plastic tubs filled with wax cappings. "You throw this away?" Arthur asked. "Some." "Why?" "Too much work for what I get back." Arthur smiled slightly. He had heard that logic before. "How much do you want for it?" Daniel laughed. "You want to buy that?" "Yes." "Why?" Arthur picked up a handful of clean cappings. Because this time, he knew exactly what he was looking at. Less dirt. Less sludge. Higher wax content. Better traceability. More predictable processing. "What do you normally get for it?" "Almost nothing." Arthur named a price. Daniel stopped laughing. "That is more than the rendering buyer pays." "I'm not buying scrap." "What are you buying?" "Good wax that happens to be inconvenient." That became the model. Arthur did not take everything. He refused heavily contaminated material. He paid more for clean cappings. He paid less for old dark comb. Every load was weighed and labeled by source. The quality improved immediately. So did the yield. 100 pounds of beekeeper cappings produced far more usable wax than 100 pounds of mixed orchard waste. The labor per candle fell. Arthur noticed that before Emily did. "So this is cheaper. More expensive per pound, but cheaper after processing." "Yes." Emily looked impressed. "You sound like a businessman." Arthur frowned. "Do not start." By winter, 6 small beekeepers were supplying Bennett Orchard. None produced enough waste to interest a large processor. Together, they provided more than Arthur could use. He began scheduling pickups by season. Spring wax, summer wax, late season comb. The differences in color and scent remained, but now Arthur could track them properly. The old barn could no longer handle everything, so part of the candle revenue went into a separate wax room, washable walls, dedicated filtration equipment, ventilation, stainless tables, a safer heating system. Arthur resisted every expense until Clara showed him the numbers. "You are already doing the work." "I know. So build a room designed for the work." He did. Then he hired help. Not many. 2 people. Maria Lopez worked 3 mornings a week, labeling and packing. Evan Price, a young beekeeper from the next town, handled much of the raw wax sorting and heavy lifting. The first day Evan carried a 50-pound container without asking. Arthur almost objected. Then he remembered David's lesson from another lifetime of stubbornness. Work did not become less valuable because someone helped carry it. By the following spring, the northern orchard changed. The new drainage held through 3 days of rain. No standing water. No wax in the ditch. No drowned roots. Arthur planted the final replacement pear tree himself. He pressed soil around the base and stepped back. Emily stood beside him. "So the candles saved the orchard." Arthur shook his head. "No. They paid for all this." "That is not the same." "What is the difference?" Arthur looked toward the new wax room, then toward the young trees. The orchard gave the candles a reason to exist first. Emily considered that. Arthur picked up the shovel. The business was healthier now because it no longer depended on someone else's negligence. The wax came from people who were paid fairly. The quality was better. The orchard was recovering. And for the first time, since the first truck appeared beyond the fence, Arthur could look north after a rain and see only water moving where it was supposed to go. The waste had started the story, but it no longer controlled the future. 3 years after the first truck dumped beeswax waste above Arthur Bennett's orchard, the northern pear rows were green again. The drainage ditch ran clear after heavy rain. The damaged trees had been replaced. And the old barn that once held buckets of dirty wax now stood beside a clean hill. The candle business had grown, but Arthur had refused to let it grow quickly. Bennett orchard candles were now sold in several specialty stores. including 2 in New York City. Old Orchard remained the best seller. Apple Blossom sold strongest in spring. Autumn Hive usually disappeared before Christmas. Emily managed orders, shipping, and retailer relationships. Arthur still handled the wax. Every Monday morning, he walked through the processing room and inspected the incoming batches. Color, smell, debris, source. If something did not look right, it did not move forward. One afternoon, a journalist arrived to write about the business. She photographed the orchard, the wax room, and the original candle Arthur had kept on a shelf near his desk. Then she asked the question Arthur had heard many times. How did you turn waste into a luxury product? Arthur looked at her. I didn't. She lowered her notebook. But that's the story, isn't it? No. Arthur picked up a clean block of beeswax from the table. This was always beeswax. He pointed toward a container of dark residue waiting for disposal. That is waste. He placed the clean block beside it. The mistake was mixing them together and calling all of it worthless. The journalist wrote something down. So the value was already there? Arthur nodded. It was just inconvenient to recover. That was the lesson the business had taught him. Hudson Valley Honey Processing had once discarded the material because separating good wax from sludge, dirt, gum, and debris took time. Arthur had time. Then he developed a process. After that, the value became obvious. The luxury price came later. Customers paid for natural beeswax, for small batches, for hand-poured candles, for traceable materials, but Arthur never believed the price was what made the product special. The work did. That evening, after the employees left, Arthur walked through the orchard. Young pear trees now stood where the damaged ones had died. The oldest apple trees were beginning to lose their leaves. He stopped near the northern fence. The waste piles were gone. Hudson Valley had eventually moved its storage operation and installed better containment elsewhere. Arthur no longer needed their discarded material. Most of his wax now came directly from small regional beekeepers who were paid for material they once struggled to sell. The problem that started the business had disappeared. The business remained. Arthur returned to the farmhouse after sunset. On the kitchen table sat an old orchard candle in a simple ceramic vessel. He lit it. The flame settled. A mild honey scent filled the room. For a moment, Arthur thought about Margaret. She had always liked beeswax candles. He wondered what she would have said about all this. Probably that he had taken an unnecessarily difficult route to learn something simple. Arthur smiled at the thought. Outside, the orchard was dark. 3 years earlier, he had stood in those trees with wax sticking to his shovel in water, drowning the roots. He had believed he was looking at nothing but someone else's waste. He had been wrong. Not because the waste was secretly treasure. Most of it really was waste. But hidden inside it was something worth separating, something worth cleaning, something worth keeping. Arthur had not turned garbage into gold. He had done something less dramatic and more useful. He had learned to tell the difference between what should be discarded and what had simply been overlooked. The candle burned steadily. Arthur watched it for a moment before turning off the kitchen light. The luxury had never been the $48 price tag. It was the patience required to rescue what everyone else had decided was not worth the trouble.